Hey guys, it's Bree here with Blossom and Branch Farm, and today we are going to be talking about garden roses and 3 popular myths that you do not have to listen to and that I definitely don't listen to as a flower farmer who grows tons of roses. So hopefully this will actually make you feel better about growing roses because it's actually not as hard as you think. If you're going to grow a cutting garden, I highly recommend you include some garden roses in there. And that's because roses are, number 1, obviously incredibly gorgeous, but number 2, hard to get if you don't grow them yourself. Yes, of course you can buy garden roses, but they are usually expensive. So here at the farm, they actually sell for over $4 a stem, wholesale to florists, and then they mark it up usually by 3 or 4 times. So for you, the home buyer, to buy them from a florist, they're going to be looking at around $16 a stem. So you can see how it's much better to be growing them yourself. Now, the other side of this is that the roses that we get at the grocery store, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna say it, they are terrible. They have no personality. I like to do this little imitation of a rose from the grocery store. Perfectly stiff and still and upright, and it never opens and it never has any personality. It doesn't smell good. So roses that we buy at the grocery store have been bred to not smell good because that helps them ship. This may surprise you, but most of the roses you're gonna buy here in the US have been grown in Colombia and Ecuador. So in the 90s, the US government in its brilliance decided to subsidize the rose production in Colombia to help combat the drug trade of cocaine that was happening in Colombia and the production. So instead they said, hey, Colombia's near the equator, it's a great place to grow roses, it's close to the sun, year-round great growing conditions. So they started to subsidize greenhouses there, they cut tariffs on imported roses. There's a lot that goes along with this Colombian and Ecuadorian production. There's a lot of very questionable labor practices, there are underpaid workers, there is a lot of exposure to pesticides and fungicides, water issues for the surrounding villages around these greenhouses. Anyway, it's a whole nother rabbit hole I'm not gonna get down today. Basically, American flower growers cannot compete with the prices that imported roses come at. All I'm trying to say is that if you love roses, grow your own or buy them from a local flower farmer here in the US. Don't buy them at the grocery store. Anyway, so today's tips are geared toward hopefully making you feel more confident in growing them on your own because roses can be intimidating and a lot of the tips that get thrown out there, honestly, you don't have to follow. So let's get into it. False. You do not have to cut at a 45-degree angle. That is dated advice. Usually people are told that because, oh, water can pool on top of the stem. No. First of all, don't cut or prune your roses when there's rain, when it's raining, or when it's going to rain, okay? That's how you prevent water from puddling on top of your cut stems. I actually usually cut all of my roses straight across because that creates less surface area. Less surface area means faster healing time. Faster healing time means less disease. But if you're concerned about disease, there are a couple things that actually will help aside from this myth of cutting your roses at a 45-degree angle. One is select disease-resistant varieties. Most of the roses that I grow here, with the exception of one variety, which is Moonlight in Paris, which is beautiful, but I think I'm gonna rip it out this year because it gets powdery mildew every year. It's just a varietal thing. So now I've started growing roses that don't have disease problems, that are disease resistant. So when you're looking at descriptions for roses, select one that's disease resistant. If you know that you have a lot of black spot or you have powdery mildew, select a rose that's disease resistant. That's gonna help you out a lot on that battle. The other thing that is hugely helpful when you're pruning roses is disinfecting your pruners. Disinfect your shears. I just use a wipe. You can use a wipe that's been dipped in a little bleach. You can actually wash them with soap and water. Make sure you dry them off really well so they don't rust. Whatever you want to use to disinfect them, Lysol, just disinfect your pruning shears before you make cuts on your roses. That's gonna go a long way toward disease resistance beyond cutting them at an angle. The other part of pruning that I often hear that we don't follow at all and I find makes absolutely no difference is cut above a 5-leaf leaflet. It does not matter really if you cut above a 5-leaf leaflet or not. And usually what I do is I look at what my goals are for the bush. So when we are deadheading a rose, obviously it's always good to continually deadhead a rose because that's going to help it with production. One of the things that I always hear is that you have to deadhead above a 5-leaf bract, and that's just not the case. It really doesn't matter all that much where you deadhead them. And actually sometimes if you go all the way down to your first 5 leaf, that's usually further down on the stem. And if we're going further down on the stem, what that means is that we're eliminating lots of the foliage up above. This foliage is great to leave on. So if we are just deadheading for appearance on the bush, we can deadhead just right below the peduncle here and above the bract of the rose. So we can just literally take off the head of the rose. Deadheading can be that simple. You don't have to worry about the 5-leaf stem. If we are cutting for cuts, it's a little bit different. So if I'm trying to cut my rose for the vase and I'm trying to get long stems, then I will cut further down on the branch. Cutting down further when I'm cutting specifically for vases or for bouquets is going to delay my blooms, my next set of blooms, but it's going to make longer stems on my subsequent blooms because I'm going to get branching from further down on the bush, just like any cut flower. So I cut further down. I don't cut all the way down to the bottom. Usually I cut about halfway down the stem, and I cut above a bud eye that's pointing outward, but I don't worry about how many leaves are on the leaflet. It doesn't really matter. And this is Queen of Sweden, and you can see that it just has nice, long, upright stems. This makes it really easy to cut. And you can see here is a bud eye. So here is where one is going to be coming from if we're looking for our next growth. But if I cut up here toward the top, the resulting stems are going to be shorter. So I do like to cut a little bit further down so that my subsequent roses have longer stems, even if they might take a little bit longer to bloom. I'm going to cut just right above this, which is actually a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 leaf stem. I'm going to snip right there. And as you can see, I just cut straight across. And a lot of that comes down to the bush and the variety. Don't get intimidated by that. Absolutely not. I would tell you to prioritize 3 things if you're looking at getting roses. Yes, you can get caught up in Floribunda versus hybrid tea, all these different varieties of roses. Here's what I would tell you. They're all going to have not the best vase life anyway. Usually for a garden rose, we're looking at 4 to 6 days tops. So don't prioritize based on that. Here's what I prioritize. If I'm growing roses in my garden, here's what I prioritize. 1, how many or few thorns they have. I hate thorny roses. I hate pruning them. I hate caring for them. I hate deadheading them. I hate cutting them for the vase. I hate using them in bouquets because they take so much more time to do all those things, and I risk impaling myself every time I'm dealing with them. And if you get a rose thorn in your joint, it can actually be really bad. My uncle, who was actually a rosarian at a greenhouse for many years, almost lost his arm because of an infection from a rose thorn. So I don't like rose thorns. I use very heavy-duty welding gloves when I'm working with roses, but if I can, I select a variety that has very few thorns because that makes it so much more pleasant and easy to deal with. The other thing I select for, and I've already mentioned this, is disease resistance. The less time I'm having to spend on my roses, the less I'm having to worry about them being diseased potentially. And I'm also not having to worry about spraying them with fungicides or anything of that nature to keep them healthy. So number 2, I prioritize disease resistance. Number 3, I prioritize what I like the best in a rose. Now, I prefer a roughly, very heavily petaled rose, that kind of the cabbage rose, garden rose look. The single layered roses, that is, they have petals and then they have an open face in the center like a knockout rose, those ones are not going to do very well in the vase. They usually only have about a day or 2 vase life, so those ones are dramatically worse. Otherwise, any garden rose that you pick is going to be fine for cutting, okay? Don't panic about it too much. That being said, if you're growing them for long stems, you might want to look for a bush that has an upright growth habit. One like Queen of Sweden, which happens to put up very nice long stems, are great. But pick something that you are going to want to cut, something that you like the look of, the appearance of, and something that you're going to use. And also, if you're looking for a longer vase life, I actually like to pick my roses a little bit shorter. But let's look at this arrangement, for example. For myself, when I'm cutting roses to bring into the home, I actually usually cut them short and I put them in a short vase. That's because the shorter the stem, the shorter the distance that the water has to travel to get up to the flower, and that means longer vase life because they're able to hydrate better and more efficiently. The third myth that I always hear is you have to fertilize your roses, and that roses are heavy feeders. They're really not. And if you look in a landscape at, for example, an heirloom rose, an old-fashioned rose that has been around for a long time, they usually are full of blooms and they've never been fertilized. And that is the case in our field. We do fertilize each year with a scoop of our alfalfa fertilizer, and you can find that recipe. I'll link that video as a follow-up to this one. But that's all we use. We just use a little scoop of alfalfa fertilizer, which has a little bit of nitrogen in it. Other than that, if you're providing good organic matter in your soil and your soil is well balanced, they are going to be perfectly happy. I do advocate doing a soils test because that will really give you a picture and an idea of what's happening in your soil. You don't have to get crazy with it and take a million samples all over your garden. One sample from a spot that kind of averages what treatment you give everything else will give you a good idea of what your soil is looking like and if you have deficiencies. And actually, I would always rather err on the side of giving not enough fertilizer than giving too much. Giving too much fertilizer is often what leads to disease issues. It leads to things like aphid problems because too much nitrogen causes too much leafy growth too fast, which leads to aphid problems. Some of you like it when I geek out on soil, some of you don't, but there's this whole really cool thing where if your soil life is active, the plant actually interacts with the microbial life within the soil. If your roses are being attacked by a pest, your plant, they are finding, the plant will actually send out distress calls to the beneficial insects that are going to help battle that particular insect. But this only will happen if your rose has formed a healthy association with the life within the soil. Often, fertilizers keep that association from happening. They prevent that from happening. We're going to talk about all of this in our upcoming Soil Health 101 series, but for now what you need to know is that fertilizer can throw off the associations that your plants otherwise make with the soil life, and that can have repercussions down the road in terms of how pest resistant or not they are. All right, guys, that sums it up for today. 3 popular rose growing myths that I hear all the time that I absolutely do not follow, and I hope that it makes you feel a little bit more comfortable about growing roses, and know that you don't have to be so crazy about doing all this research. Roses, at the end of the day, are a shrub, okay? They're just a shrub, just like any other shrub. And as long as we're following some of the things that we talked about here in this video, you're going to be just fine. And coming up this weekend, we're actually going to be doing a little tour around the garden. We're going to be showing you our favorite rose varieties and also how we cut them to get long stems, so stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like and subscribe. It helps us out so much here at the farm. We appreciate you guys being here.